All right. So thanks for joining us today for AAMA's Member Connect. I'm Pete Gustafson, the Executive Vice President of AAMA, and I'm pleased to be joined by Mark Neumann, the Director of Customs and Compliance for Mainfreight, Inc. Founded in New Zealand in 1978, Mainfreight is today a $5 billion global logistics provider offering managed warehousing, domestic and cross-border transport, and international freight forwarding. Their 12,000 employees and 335 branch locations service 27 countries throughout Australasia, Europe, and the Americas. The leadership team at AAMA elected to open this webinar up to the entire industry, not just AAMA members. We recognize the uncertainty surrounding global trade is having a debilitating effect on everyone down to the individual consumer. We want to share as much information with as many people as possible so that together we can plan and prepare for what comes next. If you're already an AAMA member, I thank you for supporting the association in a manner that allows us to hold events like this. If you're not a member and you find value in what's to follow, please consider joining us. AAMA comprises the entire experience-based entertainment industry ecosystem, including amusement game manufacturers, distributors, suppliers, professional service providers, and experience-based entertainment center owner-operators. If you're one of those, you'll find ours to be a welcoming space filled with like-minded leaders like you. You can find a hyperlink for an enrollment form in the chat box. And if you'd like the opportunity to meet with your elected officials responsible for creating all the federal laws, policies, and regulations affecting you and your business, make plans to join us for our next Washington, D.C. fly-in, June 9th through June 11th. We'll make sure you get to meet directly with your congressional representative offices in the House and Senate so you can share how the choices they make in Washington, D.C. affect your business on Main Street. You can find a link to register for the fly-in in the chat box as well. Mark Neumann is a seasoned trade specialist and licensed U.S. Custom House broker. He's been the Director of Customs and Compliance at Mainfreight since 2007. His commitment to continuous learning and practical application has led him to establish 11 custom brokerage offices, several container freight stations and bond and warehouse locations, and soon a foreign trade zone in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Mark's role at Mainfreight extends beyond customs brokerage. He oversees export trade compliance, including CTPAT and TSA cargo security programs, ensuring that both the company and its clients navigate the complexities of international trade and cargo security with ease. Mark understands the critical importance of free trade and basic import-export compliance for the future success of our industry. His goal today is to enlighten us with timely and useful information to help us manage the ever-changing international trade landscape. I'm going to hand over this presentation to Mark, but first wanted to let you know we will hold a question and answer session at the end of Mark's presentation. Feel free to submit your questions in the chat box at any time during this presentation, and we'll get to as many as we have time for. Mark, the floor is all yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Pete, and I'd like to thank your entire organization for allowing me to present today. I'm going to give a bit of a review of tariffs, where we stand, and I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can so we can all get a chance to finish before lunch. But, with tariffs, I want to just kind of remind everybody, we've actually been here before. We've done these tariff thingies before. So what lessons have we learned? What can we apply? Well, remember in 1930, we had the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that are still the law of the land. Today, those duty rates are still in effect and apply primarily to Russia, Cuba, North Korea, Belarus, and so on. But in the 1980s, we had issues with Japan. Some of you who've been around a while may remember that Japan was ascendant. Japan was taking over U.S. business, destroying U.S. business. Cheap Japanese cars were flooding the U.S. market. There were voluntary export restraints on these cars, which led Honda, Toyota, Nissan, Subaru, Mitsubishi, and so on to set up plants here in the U.S. We had voluntary export restraints on those Japanese cars. And what they did is it effectively rejiggered things, had some manufacturing come back here, which was great. But this also kind of coincided with the rise of China beginning in the early 2000s. And US businesses flocked there because Chinese businesses could produce, they could produce cheaply, and China's become a supply chain juggernaut in the interim. Now, what's basically happened in this current time frame is we now have a lot of U.S. companies that have filed complaints against Chinese entities that have shipped products to the U.S. We've got 279 active anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases in place on goods from China. These cases were filed by U.S. competitors that felt that the goods were being dumped in the U.S. market. Anti-dumping is effectively when prices on goods from China are sold here at a price less than they're sold for in China where they're manufactured. And by the way, every country has their own anti-dumping enforcement. So the U.S. is not the only one that does this. Countervailing duties. Some of you may remember the Export-Import Bank that the U.S. had for a number of years. Those were considered subsidies to business because it allowed lower interest rates to be applied, especially to Boeing, for Boeing aircraft sales. And that was a subsidy. So that's countervailing duty. That's an example of a countervailing duty. Now, the Export-Import Bank no longer exists. But from China, with 279 cases currently outstanding, it covers articles the likes of which you see here, from aluminum extrusions to ceramic tile, passenger vehicle, light truck and bus tires, sodium nitrite, wooden bedroom furniture, tool chests and cabinets, quartz countertops, holy moly, even paper file folders. So as you can see, it's not an unusual thing for us to engage in a little bit of protectionist activities along the way. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a feel-good approach first. The common narrative that we hear in the media is that manufacturing in the U.S. is in the doldrums. Well, it actually isn't. In the past 50 years, from 1975 to today, we've actually more than doubled the manufacturing output in the USA. That doesn't fit the narrative of what we hear, does it? I just wanted to throw that out to you because I think it's kind of indicative of, we like to feel sorry for ourselves, but in actuality, we should be thinking there's been a little bit of a technological component to this, because take a look here. U.S. steel production productivity increased fivefold since 1975. It used to take 10 man-hours to produce 1 ton of steel. It's now approximately 2 man-hours due to more efficient processes and the rise of mini mills. I know this personally because my father was a steel worker at Earl M. Jorgensen Steel. And sure enough, their productivity has risen dramatically. So it takes a lot fewer people to produce more than double what we were producing 50 years back. And how about this? The U.S. is the largest oil producer globally due to fracking and shale oil extraction technologies. Take a look. If you look at the U.S., we are #1 in the world in oil production. That doesn't fit the common narrative. That's not what we hear in the news. If you added up Saudi Arabia and Russia's oil output together, it would still be less than what we produce every year. That's pretty darn impressive. So I kind of want to raise the flag a little bit on that. We've got a lot to be proud of here. And take a look, top 5 countries by GDP at the end of 2024. USA, we are #1 at 30.34 trillion US dollars. China's next at 19.53 trillion, with Germany a distant third. Now, what's fun here is that that's overall gross GDP, does not take into account population disparities. The US has approximately 1/4 the population that China has. So if you look at that GDP and base it by population, our GDP overwhelms them on a per capita basis in an amazing amount. So that's going to just kind of take us into the laws involved in tariffs. A lot of US companies source from China for the same reasons that we talked about a minute ago. Pricing, that's a big deal. Well, not only did we have US companies complain through anti-dumping cases and countervailing duty cases against the competition, but the laws that were involved by the first Trump administration got a little bit more serious about punishing, if you will, companies that sourced from China. So Section 301 of the trade law is the main law that's been used for additional tariffs on goods from China. And that's something that alleges discriminatory treatment on US goods being sold to China, right? And then there's Section 232. This is a national security provision of law, and it's primarily used for steel and aluminum goods. Now, what's new this year with the Trump administration in the past 3 months is the IEEPA. This is a trade law that requires the declaration of a national emergency, usually pertaining to unusual or extraordinary threats to national security, the economy, or foreign policy. And as it's been issued, we have two different aspects of the IEEPA. First off is the fentanyl version, and these tariffs, we will call that the 20% tariff on Chinese goods that first went into effect February 4th at 10% and then increased to 20% on March 4th. And that's fentanyl. The national emergency there was alleging that fentanyl has been flowing into the US from China. And then it also impacted Canada and Mexico as well. There were, I think, 19 kilos of fentanyl coming from Canada to the US in the last couple years. And I think Mexico's had tons. And of course, China is certainly been accused of having tons of fentanyl come through these small little packages, right? Now, the IEEPA reciprocal tariffs, these are the ones that went into effect just a little over 2 weeks ago. Now, that's more involved because that's global in scope. And then what the first Trump administration did was something called safeguard tariffs due to a finding of an import surge. There was an import surge of washing machines, LG and Samsung washing machines. So at the same time, steel and aluminum tariffs went into effect back then and several years ago. There were also restraints on washing machine imports into the USA. It also impacted solar cells and panels. Now, also during the first Trump administration, we had steel and aluminum mill goods. We're talking goods that are not really designed as finished products, things that you'd find in the store. These are intermediate mill products, if you will. And it was 25% on steel mill products and 10% on aluminum mill products. Now, that was global in scope originally. Canada and Mexico was removed. Tariff rate quotas were put in place for the European community and selected other countries. These particular steel and aluminum tariffs, 25 and 10, if you will, expired only 6 weeks ago on the 11th of March. Now, let's do a quick review as well, because the Section 301 tariffs on Chinese goods began in earnest in 2018. Now, list 1 was 818 tariff lines, 25%. List 2 was 279 tariff codes, 25%. List 3 was 5,745 tariff codes. Wow. And that started out as 10% and then went to 25%. And then list 4A, which went into effect in 2020, was 3,244 harmonized tariff codes. Wow, that's pretty wild. Now, I want to make a quick point here. Drawback was allowed on these Section 301 tariffs. These items, you could import them, you could put them in non-privileged status into a foreign trade zone or into a bonded warehouse. Non-privileged basically means that you could do kitting, minor manufacturing, and allow the true benefits of a foreign trade zone kick in. In other words, the finished good that came out of a foreign trade zone could have a significantly lower duty rate than the inputs that went into the foreign trade zone. Keep that in mind, because that's very, very, very different from what we've got now. All right. The problem we had with China tariffs is that a lot of US manufacturers and a lot of importers cried foul. They said, we demand exclusions. There are certain things we cannot get made in the United States. There were exceptions or exclusions to these Section 301 tariffs and the steel and aluminum tariffs. It was crazy, hundreds, if not thousands. My favorite is a windshield wiper blade. Windshield wiper blades for commercial vehicles have the exact same harmonized tariff code as windshield wiper blades for your car. But guess what? Commercial manufacturers, let's think Peterbilt, Kenworth, Sterling, and so on, and bus manufacturers were able to get a very product-specific exclusion from the 25% tariff rate. And again, the goods now had to meet a very specific product description, so it was kind of a subset. Frankly, from an administrative level, as a customs broker, it was extraordinarily difficult to handle simply because those wiper blades were not broken out by commercial wiper blades or consumer wiper blades for passenger cars and light trucks. Now, surprisingly enough, when the Biden administration came in, these Section 301, Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs remained in effect. As a matter of fact, the exclusions have gradually disappeared. There are still a few items out there that have exclusions that will expire at the end of next month. But the Biden administration wasn't content to just leave those tariffs in place because, let's face it, there's been no appetite from Congress or the American populace to remove these tariffs that went on Chinese goods and the steel and aluminum mill products back in the day. In September last year, the Biden administration put additional Section 301 tariffs. 382 tariffs increased on September 27th from electric vehicles from China, shipped shore cranes and solar modules. EVs went up to 100% for that matter. On January 1st, 25% additional tariffs were added to certain tungsten items and articles, and an additional 50% additional tariffs were put on silicone and certain chemicals doped for electronic use. Wow. Okay. Now we're getting into the meat of the matter, because just since January 20th, hard to believe that's only, 13 weeks ago now. On February 4th, we had the first 10% additional tariffs added, stacked on top of those Section 301 tariffs that were already in effect for goods from China. Now, that 10% was effective from February 4th through March 3rd. And de minimis, you've all probably heard about these small value products, I call it the Shine, Temu, Amazon, that sometimes you'll go to Amazon and you probably would know, it would say that, well, if you order it, you're not going to get it for a couple weeks. Well, that's because it was coming directly from China on a cargo airplane, already labeled with your name and address, UPS or USPS label already on it. Anything under $800 value, they were duty free. No customs entry had to be done on these goods. So for 3 glorious days, 4th, 5th, and 6th of February, with 9 hours advance notice, those goods were prevented from coming into the U.S. duty free. We had cargo planes that could not get their cargo off the plane because they hadn't cleared customs for 3 solid, glorious days. Airports from O'Hare to LAX to DFW, Atlanta, Hartsfield, JFK, Newark were filled with these cargo planes that were already in the air coming to the U.S. that just happened to arrive after midnight and arrived on February 4th. These goods could not clear. So what happened? Those planes literally had to leave the country because on the 7th, or the 8th rather, the de minimis exemption was put back into effect. So that's our first little consistency problem that created a big issue. One, there was no time to put into effect the prohibition on these goods, right? And then when it was put back into effect, it was not retroactive to February 4th. So for 3 days, there were different tariff rates applied, if you will. In other words, you were going to be forced to pay duties on these small value packages for 3 days. Then it was put back into effect, but again, not retroactive. Now, what happens next week is that entire de minimis thing is canceled as of May 2nd, 1 week from today. Well, then we had even more fun kick in. Why? Because on March 4th, that China tariff increased from 10 to 20%. And again, it's still on top of those tariffs that were put in place years ago. The only difference is it now covered every single item in the tariff schedule. Now, what even became more challenging here is that between March 4th and 6th, a 25% tariff was applied to every single item from Canada and Mexico. Didn't matter whether they qualified as originating under the USMCA. And on March 7th, Canada and Mexico items were again free as long as they conformed to the USMCA. Otherwise, it was going to be 25% for all other goods except potash and energy products that would have an additional 10% duties attached. So now we see we had 25% on 3 days worth of everything coming from Canada and Mexico. Then it was only going to be applied if those goods did not meet USMCA requirements. Then on March 12th, remember the steel tariffs we talked about and aluminum tariffs we talked about. The tariff rate quotas, the 10% on aluminum, and so on, that all expired March 11th. So on March 12th, a 25% was going to apply globally, except for goods from Russia, 200%. But here's the twist, and this is the interesting part. The steel and aluminum tariffs now were going to include something called derivatives. And they created a list of articles that they felt would, if they included steel or aluminum content, and they gave a small list of these articles, you would have to figure out the cost of the steel, cost of the aluminum, and pay the 25% duty on that portion of the finished good. I've been in this business 36 years. I've never seen anything like this before. Because usually when you buy a product from overseas, you're buying the finished product. You're not really buying the components of that product. So that's a very new thing. The only exemptions from the steel and aluminum tariffs would be only on articles made from steel that was melted and poured in the US or aluminum that was smelt and cast here in the US. But there was more to come, because on April 3rd, automobile and light trucks had a 25% tariff put in place on those as well. Now, this impacts cars made in Mexico, or vehicles made in Mexico, vehicles made in Canada, and auto parts are still expected to follow next Friday. We don't have any guidance on that. Part of the challenge we have had in this industry is that we don't typically get the written guidelines until the day before these tariffs go into effect. And boy, let me tell you, it's really hard for you and your customers to be able to plan around that when you don't get much lead time. Now, what became even more of a challenge, 3 weeks ago, was the imposition of what they called the reciprocal tariffs. And here's where it became even weirder. From April 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, an additional 10% tariff was implemented on all products globally except Canada and Mexico. And what was weird, it was just 4 days. Because what happened, you all probably remember the president got into Rose Garden and had these, I don't know, chalkboards, I guess, saying that, well, we've run a formula and we've determined that Japan should be at 24% additional, China should be at 34% additional, and Vietnam at 46% additional reciprocal tariffs. And 4 days later, on April 9th, those rates would all go into effect. So for 4 days, April 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, that 10% applied to Japan, to China, additional to Vietnam, to Cambodia, to all these other 83 countries that were on that list. And what was weird about it is that if your shipment was on leaving that country on or before on April 4th or earlier, or the bill of lading date on the ocean bill of lading was April 4th and earlier, these reciprocal tariffs would not apply on those articles. So in other words, it could take 2 to 4 to 5 weeks for the goods to get here by ocean freight, but those tariffs would not be applied until then. But what the weird part was, is that on April 9th, China had that reciprocal additional tariff set at 84% on April 9th only. And then on April 10th, it went up to 125%, right? And remember, that's on top of that 20% that was put into effect on March 4th. And that's on top of those Section 301 tariffs that went into effect beginning 7 years ago. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is the first time we now had a bunch of exceptions. First off, if the goods were steel and aluminum articles and derivative articles that were already subject to the now 3-week or almost 4-week-old 25% tariffs, they were exempt. If they were automobiles and auto parts that were subject to the 25% tariff that went into effect on April 3rd, they would be exempt. If they were from a trading partner subject to column 2 duty rates, basically column 2 is what I call the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. Surprisingly enough, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs are still in effect. It's just that it applies to those countries we talked about, like Russia, Cuba, North Korea, that sort of thing. The other items exempt were these items. And this is because the IEEPA doesn't allow duties to be put on these items, the informational and communication goods. Now, what was otherwise interesting is that copper, semiconductors, articles of lumber, energy and energy products, certain critical minerals, and pharmaceuticals would be exempt as well. And most of those items are also subject to a current investigation by the Secretary of Commerce office to determine whether anti-dumping or countervailing duties should be applied to them as well. If goods came from Canada and Mexico that qualified as originating under the USMCA, they would be exempt from the reciprocal tariffs as well. Number 7 is the odd part. For articles in which 20% of the value of the article is US originating, the US content would not be subject to the reciprocal tariff. Oh my goodness, okay. Now, what's even harder for us to understand is that those original reciprocal tariffs ended up not being put on those countries, the 83 countries, as of April 10th. Rates higher than 10% were suspended for 90 days, paused. But word has been coming out of the White House this week that, well, the China tariffs may come down, but we don't know about it. Maybe in 2 or 3 weeks, we'll have reciprocal tariffs implemented on some countries, but we don't know yet. The problem we have is that we don't know. We've got a lack of consistency here, right? But what was really interesting was that 2 weeks ago, Friday night, late Friday night, I'd gone to bed already. There were exceptions granted to the reciprocal tariffs on smartphones, computers, flat screen displays, and semiconductors. And that was going to be retroactive to April 5th. Interesting. I called those the Apple exclusions. But can you imagine? You've got 145% minimum additional tariffs on Chinese goods just added since February this year. That's pretty significant. That is very significant. Now, we've got issues with this, right? There's no drawback permitted on these additional tariffs that were implemented due to Section 232 or the IEEPA fentanyl. And that's the first 20% that went on to Chinese goods earlier this year, and the steel and aluminum and automobile tariffs that went into effect over the past several weeks. But what's strange is that the IEEPA reciprocal 10% tariffs, or 125% for China, has drawback eligible. But what's weird about this as well is that, remember, we talked a little bit ago about how foreign trade zones would usually confer a bit of an advantage. Under the IEEPA and Section 232 tariffs as implemented, if they're entered into a foreign trade zone or bonded warehouse, something called privileged foreign status applies. This is not what the law normally requires, just so you know. This is what the implementation of these additional tariffs under the IEEPA and Section 232 implementation says is required. Privileged foreign status means that the goods go in at the highest tariff rate that's applicable when they hit U.S. soil. And no matter what happens to those goods in the foreign trade zone or bonded warehouse, and no matter when they come out, they will pay the original duty rate that was applicable to that item when it first hit U.S. soil. In other words, it didn't matter if you did light manufacturing, thought you changed it into something different, you were still going to pay that high duty rate on the finished good, no matter when it came out of the foreign trade zone or bonded warehouse. Again, that's contrary to normal U.S. foreign trade zone and bonded warehouse process. So this is a bit pernicious, very different. What the administration also said is, remember, we talked about de minimis being canceled from China. Well, according to the president, once they find a way to efficiently collect and administer tariffs on small packages from Canada and Mexico, those entries are going to be prohibited as well. Wow, that's pretty crazy. But there's more details that we're concerned with. The Secretary of Commerce was given 90 days. We're just over 80 days into the process to determine what additional derivative articles are going to be subject to that list of derivatives. And derivatives means anything made with steel or aluminum. Your pants have a steel zipper. That steel zipper could be subject to additional tariffs. Not yet, but it could be. But the proclamation, the executive order issued by the president, states that once the Secretary of Commerce can efficiently find a way to collect the tariffs, they're going to be added to the list of additional tariffs required. And the challenge we have is that we now, as customs brokers, have to go to importers and say, hey, do you know the cost of the steel and the quantity of the steel in kilos that came in on this finished product? And you're not buying the steel component, you're buying a finished product, right? Well, now you've got to make a good faith guess. And that's kind of crazy. That's the first time I've ever seen duties having been to be broken out like that. Now, under the proclamation, U.S. manufacturers, trade groups, and associations and such are able to petition the Secretary of Commerce to add more derivative articles from all countries to the list requiring the 25% duties, right? And if they deem it a valid request, the additional duties are going to be added on to those items for steel and aluminum. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Now, here's the challenge we also have, because guess what? There are no exclusions available for anybody at this time. But the fiscal impact is pretty big. Assume you buy $10,000 worth of goods with a most favored nation duty rate of 5.7%. If the goods are coming from Canada and Mexico, there's going to be no duty at all as long as the good meets USMCA origination requirements. If they don't meet USMCA origination requirements and they come from Canada and Mexico, there's going to be $3,070 worth of duty if they don't meet USMCA requirements. You're going to have to pay 5.7% plus a 25% tariff. China jumps up to $15,070 duty if it was not already subject to the Section 301 tariffs that were originally applied in 2018 and 2019. But $17,570 duty on that $10,000 item if it was subject to the Section 301 25% tariffs from back then. And the reciprocal tariffs at 10% mean that your duty rate jumps from $570 to $1,570. Wow, that's pretty crazy, right? So from a business impact, we've got big problems because you're probably locked into long-term contracts with your clients that may not allow you to recover the additional import taxes or tariffs or duties. That creates accounts receivable and pricing concerns, right? And what has happened as a result of this inconsistent tariff application and knowledge as to when they're going to take effect? I hate saying it, it's pretty much happened already. Order cancellations are crazy. Just in the past 3 weeks, it's safe to say that ocean freight bookings, not just at Mainfreight, but throughout the entire country, are down about 35%. 35%. Last time we had this type of a collapse in freight movement was during the Great Recession in 2008. That's pretty impactful, and I hate saying it, that's pretty recessionary too. Pricing on the Trans-Pacific eastbound is under pressure. And check this out. They've already indicated that beginning this fall, there's going to be an estimated $300 per ocean container added to ocean shipments that arrive in the US on Chinese origin vessels. Again, the devils are in the details. They're floating $30 per net ton of the vessel. We have no idea what it's going to end up being because it's going to be by per vessel. But wow, retaliation is the problem, right? Because the US doesn't exist in a vacuum. What we do, other countries can retaliate, and China did. China hit US goods with a 125% tariff on US goods. And even worse, they issued a prohibition on their airlines being able to take delivery of any US-made Boeing planes and US aircraft parts. Now, Boeing is the largest exporter by value that the US has. Now, Canada has put in place 25% auto tariffs, and indeed, there's some tariffs they've put in place that affect things like bourbon from Kentucky, for example. European Community has started issuing some retaliation on digital services and such of US companies. But you know what's we've really been very blessed and very fortunate, though, in that most countries are kind of sitting it out. You know, they said, okay, fine, US, you want to hurt your consumers, you want to hurt your business and your economy, great, and it'll hurt us too, but we're not going to put additional tariffs on US products. So they're kind of sitting this out. This is kind of nice in a way because tariff wars don't really, nobody really wins a tariff war. It sounds great in theory, but the actual reality is higher prices, lowered business investment, a lot of uncertainty. And the uncertainty is just manifested by the fact that you have tariffs go in place, they come off, they go back in effect again. And, you know, back in early April, we had 1 week where goods from China had 3 different tariff rates applied over 3 separate days in 1 week. How can you make a decision? How can you make an honest supply chain decision when you really don't know what your landed duty paid costing is going to be. It's really, really, really hard. It's really hard, and of course, we try to help out because there are some options out there, but unfortunately, some of the options aren't available. But the one option that we suggest to people, if it can work for you, is something called first sale. First off, I'm going to tell you Customs hates first sale, and I'll tell you why. Because it basically means that you're going to have two invoices for the same purchase. Let's say you go to a trading house or a supplier in Guangzhou, China, and I'm just using China as a good example here. And they say, yeah, okay, that's great. We'll sell it to you at this price. Well, chances are they work with a factory. And if your supplier in Guangzhou is willing to share their profit margin, what you can do is set up an agreement with them, provided you don't go around them and go directly to the factory, where you can pay duties only on the X factory price. So that means you'll have two invoices. One invoice you'd present with a lower cost on it to US Customs and paid duties on the lower cost from the factory direct. And then you're going to have another invoice for the same transaction to your supplier that you're actually paying for the goods that will have the higher price on it that incorporates their margin. But not every trading house is going to tell you, or supplier is going to tell you what their profit margin is. But if you've got a great relationship with them, you sign the required NDAs, where you agree not to go behind them, contact the factory directly, and so on. And you set it up properly with your legal counsel to ensure you don't get snared by customs. It's great. It's not applicable to all scenarios. If you're buying from a factory already, it's not going to work for you. So what other customers have done is that a lot of times they're just warehousing goods in Canada now and importing them on an as-needed basis to the USA. You still have to pay the tariff rate that's applicable to the country of origin, not the country of export. But you can stick the goods in a warehouse in Canada and then just bring them into the US on an as-needed basis with the hopes that the tariff rate on goods from China will decrease by the time you actually bring them in to meet your market needs. It's a possibility. The other option that a lot of customers like to do is transshipment. Well, transshipment doesn't help because the tariff is, like we talked about a second ago, is based on the country of origin, and it's binding regardless of the country of exportation. So first sale is probably the only real option that you have to legally reduce duties being paid to the US government. But again, it's not applicable to all scenarios. Your legal counsel will have to tell you whether it will work for you, and it only really works if you can get an X factory price. But now I've got some questions and answers that were sent a little earlier that I'd kind of like to address before we open up to the floor. When are tariffs applied to your shipment? And what if the rate changes when it's on the water? Well, this is where it gets interesting, because in a normal world, tariffs are applied based on the date of clearance in the US and based on the date of arrival in the US too. So let's say the goods leave Shanghai and they get off the vessel in Long Beach, California, and they clear customs in Long Beach. Under normal circumstances, the tariff that's in effect on the date the goods hit US soil is pretty much going to be the tariff that applies, except, and here's the but, the reciprocal tariffs that went into effect with shipments that departed beginning April 5th apply when those goods finally arrive. In other words, if they actually departed and have a date on the ocean bill of lading that's later than April 5th, the new reciprocal tariffs are going to apply. If the date is April 4th and earlier, the so-called reciprocal tariffs will not apply. That's confusing, isn't it? But what it really meant is that it's a delayed implementation of the so-called reciprocal tariffs, especially out of China. Now, the latest news regarding tariffs and costs, I kind of just went through that. I update this presentation daily when there's news. There actually hasn't been a whole lot of changes over the past 10 or 11 days. I think when the S&P and the Dow Jones and bonds got impacted, I think the administration figured, oh my God, we better slow down a little bit on this so the markets don't get a little crazier, you know? Any exempt tariff codes? Yes, it's in something called Annex 2. And honestly, this works if you already have access to the Did You Know emails that I send out, great. If you don't, you can send an email to me at mark.newman@mainfreight.com. I'll be happy to put you on this list. But if you type CBP space Annex 2, Roman numerals 2, and then space 2025, it'll give you the list of articles that are exempt from the reciprocal tariffs. So yeah, we'd go off of that. But bear in mind, the tariffs otherwise apply to, if they're not on that Annex 2 list, they apply to any single item that you're bringing in. Now, unfortunately, I can't really speak to Canadian tariffs, unfortunately, because I'm not a Canadian customs broker. I'm a US customs broker. I'm pretty much only good for importing into the US. So I'd suggest that you may want to reach out to your customs broker in Canada to find out the specific status there. Now, supply chain for plastics and steel. Well, we just discussed the steel and aluminum. Plastics are really subject to the reciprocal tariffs that we just discussed. So there. What database search engines do you use to find domestic vendors? Oh my goodness. That's a good question. I wouldn't know, unfortunately. I apologize. We do international freight transportation of imports and exports, so we don't really know how to find domestic vendors, unfortunately, on that. Now, the legal strategies for minimizing tariffs, we just talked about first sale. That's really the primary valid way to eliminate tariffs if you possibly can take advantage of it. Again, your legal counsel will have to confirm whether your very specific situation allows for the imposition or the use of that first sale process. And the tariff percentages get added to the shipment essentially when they, in most cases, when they arrive at port and are cleared. But like we just talked about, it depends when they departed overseas. If it was April 4th and earlier, the so-called reciprocal tariffs will not apply, even if the ship doesn't arrive until next week. But if the bill of lading date or departure date is April 5th and later, the higher duty rates will apply. So my goodness, I hope I covered those questions, but I'd like to open the door or floor to any questions that you may have now.
Hey, Mark, thank you so much. That was a lot of information. You are a busy guy these days, I'm sure.
Oh, it's been, how do I say it? I've been in this business 36 years, and I think it's very safe to say I have never seen tariffs change so quickly, go on and off quickly like this before. It's really unprecedented.
Well, let me take you through a few questions that came in while you were making your presentation.
Sure.
Mark Hollywood from PIA Products says, how are operators approaching rising costs due to tariffs? I think that's more of an industry question, I suppose. They're having to pass on those costs to their consumers.
They are. And you know, the challenge that you have, of course, is that you've already got purchase orders in place in many cases, you know, that are long standing and may have some serious lead times, right?
Yeah.
You have to go in and renegotiate them if at all possible, and put in a comment that it's subject to import tariffs in effect at the date the goods arrive in the USA.
Yeah, I
Because
think
that
that
rate
We've had
That's
manufacturers who have resubmitted POs after they get news that the shipping costs have gone up, certainly during the pandemic.
yes.
Tariffs are going into play, and they're basically decommissioning a PO and issuing a new one, keeping that
Yes.
customer in line for
Yes.
delivery as promised, but they've got to accept that new price point. So that's a little uncomfortable conversation, to say the very least.
It's a
And
very uncomfortable
yeah.
conversation. You bet it is. Yeah.
Yeah, you had mentioned, do tariffs get paid? Joe Bundra's asking, do tariffs get paid upon export of goods, and who pays and how? It's when they land on the U.S. soil, and the recipient, the person who issued the PO, is paying those. Yes.
Well, it is, but it depends on the Incoterms involved. Sometimes you buy on a delivered duties paid basis. In that case, the supplier overseas is the importer of record, and they are the ones who would pay the customs duty, and they would be the legal importer. They would just simply show your company as the consignee. Now, the challenge is, of course, when you've got tariff rates as high as 145% or higher, the supplier may not want to pay those duties, under DDP
Yeah.
terms. But under any other Incoterms out there, it's typically for you, the importer of record, the consignee who's receiving the goods, to be the legal importer and to pay those tariffs.
They're asking, Kevin Williams is asking, and Jeff Cash just came in with a similar question. Can the association create a tariff list of increased prices per manufacturer? We would be able to do that probably internally with communications with our members. I don't think
Yes,
that you
yes,
would
I think
have
that would
a
be.
list of specific tariffs applying to our industry.
It's not by It's really not by manufacturer. It's just really, you know, kind of
By item.
overall. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, are you
Um,
there, Pete? There we go.
yeah, I'm here. Can you see me?
Okay, my apologies. You cut out. I didn't hear that for some reason.
No, that's fine. You answered the question. I appreciate
I
it.
can see you, but it's locking up a little bit, Pete. My apologies.
All right. Well, there's a little rain in the area. Maybe that's causing it. It's a good thing we're coming to the end. Could you repeat the website where they could go to get information, the CBD website, please?
Oh, just basically cbp.gov. But what I would do is put in CBP for Customs and Border Protection space 2025 space IEEPA. And what that should do is it should allow you to pull up the IEEPA page where they talk about the tariffs and the FAQs. But bear in mind, you can go to Google and just type CBP for Customs and Border Protection space additional tariffs China or additional tariffs 2025, and you're going to get a ton of resources made available to you. And the challenge we have in this industry right now, Pete, is that these tariffs are literally and have been changing seemingly minute by minute. It's only been in the past few days we've been able to take a breather and just kind of digest the tariffs that have been put into effect. The only thing that is really, I'm going to almost hate saying this, but the only thing that's constant is change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
We've seen a lot of that.
yeah.
Do you think, this is from Gary Clothier, do you think freight rates will increase once the tariffs settle into a more normal rate? Are freight rates going to go up when tariffs come down?
Well, there's that possibility, isn't it? Now, what's really interesting about this whole thing is that demand has pretty much collapsed for ocean freight at this point. Port of Long Beach and LA, this is just this morning when I said the bookings have been cut 35%. That's the Port of Long Beach in LA reporting that's the number of vessels and tonnage that is not coming that they were expecting. And that was in the Journal of Commerce. So these are, I'm not trying to pull it out of thin air. I'm just trying to say that it's pretty obvious that we've seen order cancellations, a lot of them, because nobody wants to pay these high tariffs. and it's a pretty cool thing. What percentage of vessels are owned by China versus? Well, that's a pretty good question, because um, the U.S. doesn't have a whole lot of U.S. made vessels out there anymore. Our shipbuilding industry dried up decades ago. China does operate, I think it's around, I think it was around 20% or 25% of the global container ship fleet but South Korea builds a ton of container ships, and they have over the years, Japan as well. But the fact of the matter is that Costco, which is a Chinese-owned steamship line, and they're huge. They fly Chinese flag vessels, or they pilot Chinese flag vessels. You're going to be able to avoid a certain amount of that. As a matter of fact, steamship lines are already talking about how they can redeploy their fleets to keep Chinese-made vessels out of the U.S. trade lanes. But bear in mind, anytime this sort of thing happens, it does tend to increase costs, doesn't it? Because you're effectively no longer allowing for freedom of transportation, if you will. So a lot of things are still fluid, but again, they haven't issued the details on this. We don't know whether it will or will not take effect. But again, the only real true saving grace that we have at this point is that other countries, for the most part, are not retaliating. That at least keeps our export markets open. With the exception of China, really. So that's really the one bright spot that we do have.
Yeah. Now you mentioned the Apple exemption. Is that only for Apple products? Are PCB boards exempt since there are not enough U.S. manufacturers to meet supply and demand, the supply demand?
Can't speak specifically to PCB boards. I don't think they are exempt. It's not the way I understand the Apple exemption, because Tim Cook, I know, lobbied the government and the president for this at Apple. And that was primarily for any smartphone manufacturer, any flat screen manufacturer, and so on, and laptop computers and such. So basically, the consumer goods that you'd buy when you go to Best Buy, and want to upgrade your computer or phone or what have you. But the end result is, if we didn't have those exemptions, your cheapest iPhone would very quickly be $2,000. Instead of $700. The way it is now. So and the president has indicated that could change at any time. So it's not an exemption that we can really rely on.
I got a couple more questions before we close this up. Jim Dupree's asking, is there any good website to see the historical tariff rate by country? Oh my goodness. I don't really have a historical website I've ever looked at for historical rates by country. I only, you can see the current U.S. tariff book, which tells you what I call the most favored nation duty rates that have actually been in effect for probably 20 years. And they have what we call 3 columns in the customs tariff book. And you just put 2025 space HTS space USA, and it'll pull right up, and it'll tell you the normal duty rate that would apply on an item in what they call the general column. The special column is what I call countries that have free trade agreements with the U.S. And then there's the column 2 rates, which are the Smoot-Hawley tariffs from 1930, which are still legally the law of the land. And those have been in effect for 95 years. My God. Wow. The scary part from a historical perspective is that while the Smoot-Hawley tariffs never caused the U.S. depression, they were considered widely to have exacerbated it. So it is a concern. I'm hoping that we can get some consistency in, and that the administration can apply consistency and remember the lessons of history, so we don't end up having to repeat it. Well, yeah, no kidding, because that leads into a question Beth Stanley asked. Can you say more about the 35% slowdown in shipping leading to a recession? how much longer can we endure the drawback in shipping?
Well, that's the problem. Literally, once we start seeing things disappear on shelves at stores, because a lot of, Walmart and Target canceled a ton of their bookings from China. A lot of our,
Wow.
and have for a long, long time. So, unless the goods are made outside of China, and some of them are, you're going to start seeing the result in your stores within the next 2 to 3 weeks, I would say, just simply because it filters through the supply chain fairly quickly. I don't think, honestly, until the average American sees changes in what they can and cannot buy, it may not have an impact on what the decision makers in DC put into effect. It just kind of reminded me of what it was like 25, 30 years ago, where you would look for seasonal vegetables and seasonal fruits at the store. But now we have a worldwide global supply. But if you choke that supply off, you may end up being forced to cook with the seasons like we used to back in the day, as opposed to being able to make whatever you wanted, So it's just I think we've got a hell of a bumpy ride coming up, and certainly all of you are on this call because this concerns you very deeply as well. Certainly impacts profit margins. It impacts companies' ability to maintain a supply chain that's consistent with profit margins that you not only want to maintain, but more importantly, need to maintain in order to stay in business, at a comfortable level. So we're certainly aware that these high tariffs are pretty deleterious to the business fortunes of a lot of our clients, and for you and your association.
I'm keeping you over just to get another question in. Have you, obviously, with the reduction in ocean freight, a dramatic reduction, has there been a dramatic increase in air freight?
No. There briefly was, ever so briefly, at the beginning of the month when the reciprocal tariffs kicked in, but that really hasn't been the case since. No.
Well, all right, Mark, we've kept you long enough. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to put this together. That was really, really great information. Folks, we will be sharing that with you. Those that you are members, we'll give you a link to the video as well as a link to the deck. So you'll be able to review that in the future. I get it. Some of the news is not very pleasant, but it's better to know than not know. So we can all together look at the challenge as we move forward. Couple of notes. Remember, we're going to DC in June. Would love to have you join us on there so you can tell your representatives how the decisions they make in Washington, D.C. are affecting your business on Main Street. That's a very effective way of getting your message delivered. And believe it or not, those people want to hear what you have to say because they do want to get reelected. Again, Mark, thank you for providing this value of information and being part of today's AAMA Member Connect. Folks, we're going to say goodbye. Have an enjoyable weekend and go Cubs.
There you go. Thank you so much.
My
Have
pleasure.
a great weekend, folks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.